On today's episode of Dance Med Spotlight, I'm speaking with Dr. Rob Tsai, a physical therapist, owner of DANCEPREHAB Physical Therapy and Performance, primarily works with young and adolescent dancers, has dance background himself. We talk a lot about so many different things. I love the conversation that we have, getting really deep into some different areas. We talk about some of the culture of dance and acknowledging the culture and historical background of the different dances that we are a part of. The idea that movement is an experience and that experience informs the mover. How we're working with our young dancers. We talk about self-advocacy. We talk about things from the business perspective and the clinician perspective. And it's something where we could have had 10 hours of recording, I think, and still not have covered everything. But we're going to break this up into 2 chunks. So you're going to get part 1 and later part 2 so that you can get the full experience of this amazing conversation with Rob. So be sure to check this one out. Welcome back to another episode of Dance Med Spotlight, where we talk about all things dance medicine and dance science. Today, I am super excited about my guest, Dr. Robert Tsai, or Rob, physical therapist and owner of DANCEPREHAB. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you, and thankful to be connecting again.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our chat. I know when we were at IADMS, the annual conference for the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science last year in Columbus, we had some really good chats. So I know it's going to be good.
Yes, absolutely.
So first question that I always ask everybody on here is, give me sort of the short story version of what got you to this point of wanting to work with dancers and in the ways that you do.
So I feel like this this question is best answered by sort of like the lessons I've learned along the way from
Mm.
the get-go. So I grew up in Taiwan. I was born here in the US, but my parents were still, living back in Taiwan. So I grew up in Taiwan, but I also went to an American-based sort of like program, like a K-12 international school. So from the get-go, culture was always a thought process for me.
Mhm.
The duality of like Taiwanese and American culture. I was, living in a Taiwanese home, but growing up in sort of like American education, and I'm learning these things about America, American history, and what does that mean to me as a Taiwanese kid growing up in Taiwan. So culture was always very important to me, and it's always been a big conversation, and especially now as well, talking about dance, right? So I played baseball for 10 years and then realized that self expression was something I was really interested in getting into. I used
Mhm.
to have to do a lot of like tutors growing up because, emphasis on like academics in an Asian household. And the arts were my way of getting out of doing my tutoring because I would have to, I realized that my parents could pull me out of a baseball game really easily. But if I had a lead role or an important role in a theatrical production, that was a lot harder for them to do. So
Mhm.
that was sort of my accidental foray into the arts. But I started dancing, like enrolled in a dance class, doing all of that my sophomore year of high school. And same thing, dance came from like a more cultural perspective. And this was, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when my teacher in high school, her name is Deb Fleming. She really introduced dance as sort of a reflection of culture and social energies. And
Mm.
so we learned that, for example, ballet, is a ethnic dance reflective of 16th century French and Italian upper class vibes. But then you'd
Mhm.
also learn about dances from Papua New Guinea, dances from Japan, dances from like other countries and other societies where movement was a reflection of that.
Mhm.
After high school, I danced and trained at Chapman University, which at the time was a little bit more so classical modern. The program itself is different now, but um, coupled with my interest in breakin. So going back to the whole cultural aspect of of learning dance, breakin was this American export to Taiwan that was, you're like, wow, this is so cool. Like who started these things? Who invented breakin? And so that's when you begin to learn
Sure.
about um, like 1970s Black and Latino culture in the Bronx in New York. And who am I as a Asian American kid growing up in Taiwan? Like, how do I relate to this dance? How do I relate to the people that created this dance? And that's always been, it wasn't a struggle necessarily, but I think it was an acknowledgement of that the reasons why I fell into this type of dance, or the reasons why I fell into hip hop and breaking, are probably very different from the reasons why they created it. And so,
Hmm.
once again, just an acknowledgement of movement and where it came from and what it meant to me, and how do I properly represent those ideas and those sort of like foundations that it came from.
Sure.
And perhaps even in some ways, can I represent those things as the person I am with the upbringing I had?
Hmm.
Um, so going into college, once again, more classical modern. And then I actually after college, I spent more time in the commercial dance industry. And while I was in the commercial dance industry for about 8 years, I really fell in love with teaching. And I think obviously we were doing it to sort of pay the bills as well.
Hmm.
But I think there was something very powerful about watching students change. And so my primary group of kids I just happened to work with was at junior high to high school age. And so being able to see that process for them, to see how like movement would change them, how they would perhaps like grow more confident, or perhaps the lessons that they were learning through movement was very wonderful to see. And so there came a point in my career where I had to decide whether or not I wanted to continue pursuing sort of performance, which would then inherently mean like, oh, becoming a choreographer and becoming an artistic director, or there's this other path of education and learning about the body. And physical therapy was something that was put on my plate by Robin Kish, who was my mentor my undergrad years at Chapman. And she's always been very supportive in that realm. And so her office was the first place I went to. This was back in 2012, and we had this conversation about health and wellness, and um, I haven't looked back since.
Hmm.
So returned to physical therapy school, and then from there, we were talking about IADMs, and my first one was in 2017 in Houston, and I was still a student then, so it was really nice to just like see this whole world that I had heard about so much. And we were able to dive into research and things, but to be in that community was sort of very eye-opening for me as a student at the time, like what was
Hmm.
available, and to listen to the conversations that were happening at that time, like the research that was needed. How do we reach the populations that we do? How do we make this information applicable? How do we get information to people? Which are all very relevant conversations now.
Yep.
Um, and then actually after school, I worked in a clinical experience wise. I had a variety of different experiences, and I worked in I guess you could call it like a workers' comp type of setup,
Hmm.
that was sort of within like the entertainment industry. So I did work with performers at the time. The area I worked with also, unfortunately, needs to, on the professional level, remain unnamed and anonymous. But the place that I worked in, had dancers and performers and theater, so we were able to help those dancers. But it many of the employees there were also low socioeconomic status individuals, and it really opened my eyes to the idea of how, it's like what the healthcare experience is, and that role in chronicity of pain, or like the things that people struggle with. Um, and I suppose like access in some
Hmm.
ways, in many different ways, and that continues to be a conversation. Um, and then COVID hit, so I had to shift gears, um,
Yep.
which meant I went into home health. And home health is great because there, where my previous job taught me sort of about like the different levels of care that needs to happen for people and taught me a little bit about the healthcare system.
Hmm.
Um, Going into home health kind of expanded my view of like the lifespan. So I saw obviously, more older folk, and it was a lot of these conditions that I feel like are preventable or could be addressed earlier. And so you saw people in a state where their life choices, the current state they were in, or the way that they existed at that point when I met them, was informed by their choices made before. And whether or not that was like education or healthcare experience, we just have to acknowledge like you had a certain experience that brought you to this point, right?
Hmm.
So all across the lifespan. Um, and then I was always working on the side as far as like wanting to treat dancers, and dance prehab initially started as just me on a Saturday afternoon in a small Pilates studio in Orange County. Um, and it just started gaining a little bit of traction. I think it was also kind of timing wise also provided some luck, because people, as you know, people were very interested in the health and wellness conversation, wanting to
Hmm.
train, wanting to stay up on their training when training wasn't as robust or available. So over the years, we're now in our fourth year, going on our fourth year, and there's myself. I'm very fortunate to have two physical therapists that work with me, and also an administrative assistant. So it's interesting. I feel like I've kind of just continued to fall into things, but I also think it's just remaining open and listening to what the community is saying and trying to fill the gaps in the way that is in the way that makes sense for the people that are asking the questions or like wanting things. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah,
a
most
quick rundown
definitely.
of my life. Yes.
No,
Yeah.
I think
And
that's
then I live in
awesome.
California. Oh, I was gonna say I
Oh,
live
go
in
ahead.
California. My wife is Crystal. She is also a dance educator. Has taught me a lot about educating dance and being in the dance education space.
Hmm.
We have a little pug, and we have a 6-month-old son. So watching him grow and figure out motor patterns has been fascinating.
Yes, the joys of being a physical therapist and just having it surround us with all the things that we see, family members, little ones. Can't get away.
Yeah, and I understand there are different thought processes. So my approach, I guess you could say, is informed by, right? I guess if you're a physical therapist, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, or like DNS, a lot of things from the Prague school where there's like developmental sequencing, but a lot of that also is informed by Bartenia fundamentals, which we picked up in somatics. And so it was this really nice
Mm.
intersection when I found out about DNS, and people were talking about these ideas. I was like, oh wait, that's totally like, you know, Bartinief. Like I can totally, the growth and the maturation and the discovery of motor patterns and how we like facilitate those things over life, how we develop strength, how we develop awareness. So a
Mhm.
kind of nice like intersection moment for me in terms of like education and realizing like, oh, there's definitely intersections between like obviously dance movement, dance learning, and also kind of like physical therapy, growth and maturation, and rehab and training.
Mhm. Tons of connections for sure. I love some of the different things that you brought up, and it's like my brain is going, "Which one do we wanna talk about first?"
Yes, I
Um,
know. Yeah.
I think so one that I think is an important one, just from like a professional standpoint, is your point of having some experience in some different settings and with different demographics and that sort of thing. I have had quite the professional journey myself in how I've gotten to be where I am, working in inpatient in the hospital and doing a lot of like ICU and wound care and things like that. And then I went to outpatient, just a traditional clinic that was a mix of all kinds of things. And then I started doing PRN and per diem work, covering wherever I was needed. So it sometimes was skilled nursing facilities, outpatient clinics, workers' comp clinics, all of these different places, back in the hospital doing some per diem work. spending a lot of my time in neuro ICU in particular, and then starting to work more specifically in the dance space and taking all of those different experiences, learning about people's home situations and how varied they can be and how that affects their health, how they're able to work with me as a physical therapist, how I need to accommodate things for them to make sure that it makes sense for where they are in life, what resources they have, all of those kinds of things. Um, Different health conditions, like you said, seeing people at different stages in life and kind of seeing how did we get here? And are there things that we could have done differently? But I think that there was so much value in getting to see all of that along the way, because now it gives me a lot of other perspective and things to consider when I have whatever individual in front of me, even though I am in this really specific niche of dance medicine. So it's been a cool thing to
Yeah,
see.
agreed. I think going back on experiences, I would I missed this in my little intro, but my pediatrics rotation in school actually has played a really large role in this idea of creativity. I guess you could call it, or most people would refer to it as that. And that's a comment I get a
Yeah.
lot is, people are like, wow, that's so creative. How did you come up with that? How did you, you know, well, what are the things that, you know, you do to try and be creative? I don't know. Is this like a formula you have or something? And the honest
Mhm.
answer is that no, I just look at the person in front of me and I see what they need to do. And then I'm interested in how can I create an environment that accomplishes those tasks, at least on the clinical end.
Mhm.
In my pediatrics rotation, I was working a lot with early intervention, so ages 1 through 3. And
Mm.
so communication's out the door. You are, they are driving the bus and you are like, perhaps you're backseat steering, but you know what I mean? It's like and I think that's something that I try to impart on the clinicians that have very graciously decided that they wanted to join dance prehab, Claire and Lizzie, thank you. But I think that's something we talk about often, right? Is we need to remind ourselves that they're kids, and so they are children. They're still developing both physically and mentally. So
Mhm.
what are the challenges that we have as clinicians, and both in terms of the clinical choices and the movement choices that we make, and also the word choices that we make in terms of how we're creating that healing experience for them. So
Mhm.
um, and there are multitude of ways that I think we discuss that, when we have our clinical discussions. But the main one I think for us is like, yeah, if you didn't have language and you didn't have the ability to communicate something, how do you construct an environment that is going to allow them to experience, build, and ultimately adapt to the forces that they'll need to adapt, or perhaps the energies to make available to them, right?
Yeah.
Um, my second point to you saying what you were saying about just understanding all the different factors that come
Mhm.
in. Um, yeah, it's always been an interesting dynamic, I think, to try and frame rehab and training and what kind of experience one we're trying to provide, but how are we acknowledging the person behind, right? So not just like
Mhm.
physically in terms of growth and maturation, but I also think a lot of it is just acknowledging perhaps like what their environment is at home, or what their environment is at the studio. And sometimes those are the things that need to like change, I think.
Yeah.
Once again, this is not a crucifixion of the way people run their schools or how people parent their kids. I think it's just an acknowledgement of like, when I see this kid in my space, they're feeling a type of way, and like, why is that? Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, we can even go down the route of like chronic pain in like, or psychosomatic pain in like a 12 and 13-year-old, because that's unfortunately something we see,
Mhm.
from time to time. And a lot of those triggers are environmental, um, has nothing to do with exercise selection. So I think being able to acknowledge those things, so that, okay, this is something we can solve, and like this is something that's going to require like a mental health professional, right?
Mhm.
we can consider those things. I can be nice, and I can create a nice environment where you feel safe and you feel heard and you feel like you can explore the things you need to explore. But at some point, it's also like, well, maybe you need to go see someone who's actually trained in bringing those, creating that space, but also like having those types of conversations that we, are not trained to have.
Mhm.
Um,
It makes me
yeah.
think of something that just happened this past weekend, actually, at an event that I was at. I was at the Denver Ballet Guild's Young Dancers competition. First time that I had been there. It's a ballet specific competition for, I think it's like 10 to 19-year-olds. And it's structured in a really beautiful way. I love the way that they did it. And one of the things that they started incorporating with the event directors who've been doing it for the last couple of years is doing a required wellness talk that all of the competitors need to attend. And then they invite parents and dance coaches, teachers, etc. too. And the guest speaker this time was Dr. Stephen Karaginas, who we see a lot in some of the dance medicine space. But he gave this really amazing talk. I mean, I was even sitting there like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Talking about sort of the idea of acknowledging some of the things that can happen in the dance environment, sometimes maybe some dynamics between dancer and instructor or artistic director or whoever is in that kind of more leadership position within their space, and how sometimes it can be sort of a toxic environment. And some of it also was discussions of, well, how do we keep you safe and healthy? It also includes nutrition, mental health, all of these different pieces, but really going to this idea of how do dancers learn to advocate for themselves in some of those spaces. Um, and, I heard some interesting conversations with parents who came to me the next day with some of the things that had come out of their kids' mouths in the car on the way home, talking about some of these same things. And it kind of makes me think, I had this little revelation for myself since that talk, actually, several revelations from that talk and things that came from it. But this idea of like even how I do things in the clinic with my dancers, I try giving them opportunities to have some choice in what we're doing, where it's like, okay, here are two exercises. Which one do you like better? Tell me why you like it better. Giving them language to be able to use, whether it's working with me or working with other health providers in the future, knowing how to talk about describe what you're experiencing, whether that's pain or some other symptoms, something performance related, learning about how their bodies move, just giving them the words, giving them the tools, giving them permission to have a say, and kind of starting to foster some of that idea also of advocacy in it. And so it's, I've done a lot of these things without intentionally thinking of it in that way. But after hearing that talk, it was like, oh, I think this is how this kind of ties in together a little bit. And it's been really interesting every time I kind of think about it. I feel like I have this new little aha moment just from that talk last week that I had the privilege to sit in on and listen.
Yeah. Permission is huge. I think with, you know, how do I say this? From a communications and communication theory standpoint, like power dynamics are a thing, and I think that's
Mhm.
also just like one thing to acknowledge. I don't know if, you know, I'm not I don't know if I'm the one person to solve everybody's issues, but if we can like lay the groundwork, I mean, in that realm, right? But if we
Yeah.
can lay the groundwork of like you said, like advocacy and like what does that mean? Because that can mean something very different to like a 12-year-old versus a 17-year-old versus an adult.
Yep.
I think the challenge is, I mean, first and foremost, providing a space. That's, because I think sometimes we think like, oh, you need to do these things, you need to do those things, you need to advocate for yourself. Yes, but where do you do that, right?
Hmm.
And this is also interesting talking about power dynamics because I think sometimes we as healthcare professionals or some of the conversations that we have, I think in our circles are like, well, the parent needs to understand this, the teacher needs to understand this, but I think there are also other energies that exist in our community that unfortunately I think prevent those things from happening sometimes.
Mhm.
Um, and I go back to what you were saying about like, oh, how do you, the language we use, giving the kids a choice and letting them understand that this is a place where they can explore both like movement and how they feel about movement, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think the biggest thing for me too is just letting them know like this is a place also for you to practice talking about how you feel. Um, Not necessarily emotionally, sometimes yes, but
Mhm.
also about like your physical discomforts or your ailments. How are you describing this to me? Because the way that the better that you can communicate that to somebody, the better that they can help you. And I tell them this all the time where I'm like, look, I know the questions to ask because I know how to draw it out of you.
Mhm.
But if you go off and you're working pre-professionally or you go off somewhere else, you're going to be the one that has to answer those questions, right? So, of course, every session is like, "How are you doing?" And they're like, "Fine, good." And I'm like,
Right.
"Okay, how was class?" "Oh, it wasn't bad. It was okay." And I was like, "All right,
Mhm.
what was okay about it?" They're like, "Well, I took class and like I felt like blah 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 blah," and all these things come out, right?
Yep.
Or you get specific and you're like, "Well, how was bar?" "Oh yeah, bar was fine." How was center?" "Oh yeah, center was great." And how were jumps? And they're like, "Oh yeah, no, that didn't happen." It's like, "But I
Mhm.
thought you told me things were good." So I think it's nice to be able to tell them that, look, I'm not just grilling you because I want information from you.
Yeah.
I want you to understand that this is the level of detail to which you should be able to talk to somebody about these things. Um,
Mhm.
I hope you understand that this is something you can do with us and any of our clinicians. But if you go off into the future, you know, you might tell someone that like, oh yeah, I'm good, and then they're like, okay, and next, and all of a sudden you're left with like oh wait, but there's this thing, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't know if I can, you know, we are authority figures in this space and they perceive it as such, and so sometimes they like don't want to interrupt, or they're like, oh, the same way they view a teacher where they're like, oh, I can't just like all of a sudden um
Right.
like interrupt the teacher. And so, you let them know that, hey, this is a conversation, this is a dialogue. The more that we can communicate, the more I can know, and the more you know how to express yourself, the better I can help you where you're at. Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, no, I think yeah, it's but once again, going back to the idea of like permission to speak, permission to express, and then permission to feel like permission to feel like things suck sometimes, or
Mhm.
perhaps permission to feel good. I think that's probably another big one too, right? We're so
Yeah.
used to this idea of what's next, what's next, what's next, that we forget that we need to relish in the moment sometimes with
Mhm.
these growing dancers.
Yeah. I think one thing also that you were talking about early on in your intro that I find really fascinating, and again have been learning more about as I've been doing more of this, is acknowledging some of the cultural pieces for everything too. So, one of the things, thinking about kind of the cultural side of dance, I grew up doing ballet, tap, jazz. That was, most of what I did. And then later started taking some hip hop and then got into my West Coast swing dancing. And I think first with West Coast swing, and then along the way, as I've been involved in some different conferences and things like that, I've gotten more exposure to appreciating the history and the culture from which our dances came. West Coast swing came from ultimately Lindy Hop, which came from a lot of Black and African roots. A hip hop class that I took at a dance educators conference went into the history of hip hop and some of the pillars of hip hop, what they all meant, the play of the music versus the movement, and the spaces in which you were dancing and all of these different things. And then through some of these also getting to take some Chinese classical dancing, Chinese and Taiwanese, Bollywood and Indian classical dance. I recently took a Polynesian class and Afro-Brazilian dance classes, and actually learning what these movements meant. Like in the Afro-Brazilian, I remember her saying, this stomping that we're doing in here, it used to be that when people in Africa or when they were brought to the US and, were in the throes of slavery and everything with that, they were building their homes with dirt floors, and they wanted to turn chores into something that, had some movement and had music and things that accompanied it. And so the stomping is them stomping the dirt down to pack it down for their floors. And that's why this is part of this dance movement, or things like that. And so I have gotten to so appreciate when I hear those stories of whether it's the dance form itself or specific movements within it, and why it is what it is. And I think that has become all too lost in a lot of what we do.
Yes. Yeah, and I go back to the idea of, well, so with breakin, I was always very interested. You become more interested in these like ground dynamic movements. So ultimately, it led me to to like investigating and researching things about like capoeira, and so very similar. And you're like, how do these two movements feel so similar yet
Mhm.
are in origin is 300-400 years apart? And what is that innate desire for human movement that, at least in those realms, somehow like got us to the ground, wanted us to like move low, and wanted us to like swing our bodies and move around, and create those like dynamic energies. I've
Mhm.
always been interested in sort of like human impulse for movement, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then also that the historical lens of capoeira being like a same thing, informed by um, these experience of slavery and servitude, uh, and how they sort of like disguise their martial art into a form of a dance, as to not like attract attention, or to be able to hone their craft, sort of like under the guise of dance. And
Mhm.
it's I don't know. I think like thinking back on just movement in general, and there are like so many stories to tell, and there are so many. Um, you think about like the origin stories, and you're like, these are the energies that it came out of. So I think about if I think about capoeira, and once again, a gross generalization, and I am by no means an expert in this dance, or in this movement, but it came out of a need of, it came out of oppression, it came out of repression, and it came out of this desire to move despite their circumstances, right?
Mhm.
To create something that could empower their communities, and create something that could empower themselves as individuals as well. In many ways, break-in, I guess you can say, is relatively similar in the sense of that it is a reaction. The energy itself is a reaction to socioeconomic circumstances, sociocultural circumstances in 1970s Bronx, New York, right?
Mhm.
Um, Mostly like disenfranchised um, communities that were trying to create um, their thing, and to find where they belonged with each other, and what is that energy, where does that energy belong in our community, and how does that um, keep us together but also keep us growing. um, and then fast forward, and now it's in Olympics, and you're like, huh, yeah. Which, I mean, and that's a whole nother conversation of maintaining cultural integrity on a stage like that. So over the last,
Mhm.
the better part of the last decade or so, it's been really nice to kind of see that community really integrate sort of the originators and the OGs into those conversations, to preserve the integrity of it. And not only that, but I know a lot of the healthcare practitioners that are supporting the b-boys and the b-girls that are going into the Olympics are also people from that culture, and have an understanding of that culture, and they
Mhm.
come from that community. So it's very beautiful to see, I think, like representation in healthcare in that sense. as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I want to switch
I would,
gears a little bit.
go ahead.
um, so switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a bit more about dance prehab and some of the things that you do, not only within the clinical space, but getting out into the community and all of that sort of thing. I know one of the things that I really appreciate whenever I'm surfing social media, which is all too often, of course, um,
You and
I
me both.
love, yeah, it's a thing. I love the things that I see coming from dance prehab, particularly when you're having like some of your Sunday chats and your classes with whether it's professionals or young dancers and getting groups of people together. So kind of out of what we may think of as the typical clinical space, but being able to get groups of dancers together and have conversations and other experiences. So, can you share a little bit about some of those different things that you do within the community?
Yes. Once again, I've always enjoyed education, even as a dance teacher. And so going into physical therapy, the intention was always to maintain some kind of educational support or at least explore that option. Um, I've, less about the idea of like, oh, I have information for you, and more about how can we get together and create progress, create conversations, and create dialogue. I think about um, over the last couple of years, we've always had the chance to do one-off workshops and things like that, which when I was in school was always nice to kind of at least like get that conversation started. And then would do workshops with dance companies, but also colleges and just like studios, which I do continue to do.
Mhm,
Um, I really enjoyed the Sunday sessions, which really started off on like a whim. I just was once again going back to this idea of like, yes, we have all this information, we have all these things that we would like to talk about, we have all these things that we would like to give, and things that we would like people to do. But where are the spaces that we do that? So
mhm,
ultimately, it's just a gathering. Sometimes I've had it that like, and it's like a small intimate group most of the time. There are times where we've had like two people, and there are times where we've had like 14 or 15. But the conversations are just as deep, regardless of attendance.
mhm.
Um, I'm actually in the middle of trying to figure out what our next steps are for that, because I've been doing that for about a year and a half now. I've loved the conversations, and now it's like, okay, where does this go from here? How do we make this more actionable, and how do we make it so this is something that continues to feed forward into the future and
Mhm,
into the communities that our attendees come from? But ultimately, it's that space, right? If I were to, I guess we can get a little bit more theory and ethereal here, but we have information, but what is the space in which this information can be applied and explored and ultimately made sense of, right?
mhm,
I and I understand many of us teach workshops, and I've always thought about like, okay, what is the thing that is going to be most actionable in our space? And once again, this is just recognizing the community and like kind of where they're coming from.
mhm,
um, I have always felt that my challenge was thinking about like, okay, I'm teaching this thing, and how does it translate over, and how does it remain impressionable? And I say impressionable because I understand that in my community, I'm also fighting, like, well, I don't say fighting. I am up against many distractions. Distractions in the sense of like, there's just so much information to like pull from.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of wonderful information out there. There's a lot of wonderful resources. And the truth is that more often than not nowadays, the issue I feel like I get from teachers is not that there's not information, it's there's too much. There's too
Mm,
much, and what do I do with all of it, and how do I apply it? Like, what is best? What is your opinion? And I'm like, well, how does this make sense to you? Right? So how we educate and talk to, say, a ballet studio is going to be inherently different from that of a more like contemporary competitive studio, which would then be different from
Mhm.
perhaps like a dance team studio, right?
Yep.
So once again, just kind of recognizing and acknowledging even from a cultural lens that those cultures are a little different. So information is going to be received and perceived differently.
Mhm.
Um, so so I think about the when we teach workshops or in our educational efforts, first and foremost, it's does this make sense to you? Um, and a lot of that doesn't necessarily begin with information. It begins with language. It begins with understanding where they've come from. And then the continuity of the conversation then has to lead into like where they're going to go, right?
Mhm.
How this information is going to make sense is going to be very different from someone who is going off to college versus somebody who is looking for pre-professional, like year-round training at a ballet company, right? Which might be also very different from someone who wants to stay in the US and someone who wants to go to Europe. And
Yep.
I'm like, yeah, in terms of resources and things like that, obviously very different. Or Canada, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I think at the root of it, it's creating a space where this information can be applicable to the person, the group, and then that community based off of where they're coming from and where they're going. Um, Information wise, I know we're always talking about this idea of like, what is a good warm up, right?
Mhm.
So, what has seemed to, I would say, like, what has seemed to work well in terms of education is I still teach this idea of, and it's a framework, the RAMP framework, right? Raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. It's kind of pretty standard across the
Mhm.
board, although some people are still learning about it. Um, but I love that framework because it allows dancers to explore movement qualities. And
Mm.
it's not just exercises, because we can talk exercises all day. I will actually tell people to like, if you want exercises, these people are great. Like look
Mhm.
at these resources. You can Google it really quick or YouTube really fast if you want to. And I'll talk about those things, but what I'm interested in is like, are you are you finding ways to build your capacity, and what does that mean? And a lot of times that's, moving in a way that I always say how, we'll do a movement and I'm like, does this movement feel like dance? Is this a dance movement? Squat jumps or something, or pogo
Yeah.
hops. They're like, no, it doesn't. No, it's not really dancey. And I'm like, but will dance ask you to do these things, right? And they're like,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's true. Um, so I think being able to draw those connections for them is important. This
Mhm.
idea of, and once again, we work with a population that is more so ballet centric and competitive, contemporary centric, and industry focused too. And so I think the athleticism conversation is much more pertinent to
Mhm.
these dancers. And at some point, my conversation with them is like, I know you can dance, but I also want to know if your body can handle gravity and if it can handle different forces, right? And
Mhm.
so I think, and I've been inspired by a lot of different coaches in sort of the virtual space as well. But we'll do a lot of tennis ball situations, which I think people tend to recognize. But besides being a fun activity and a nice like group interaction activity in different ways, I think it's nice to tell them that like when you have to chase this ball, it's you're just defaulting to how you move. So can you move efficiently in that way?
Mhm.
And if you have to catch the ball in like a lunge position and I ask them to reach and stuff like that, you'd be like, well, that's not necessarily dance. You're just, in space. You're grabbing the thing. But
Yeah.
can you be confident in those places? It's not just about placement and alignment. It's my relationship to the ground. If I'm trying to expand in certain areas, do I trust myself? Do I trust myself to say hold this position in space? And if I have to partner somebody, do
Mhm.
they trust me to hold this space? Right.
Mhm.
So I think those are the types of conversations that we have in terms of building capacity.
Yeah.
Jumping for muscles versus jumping for tendons, and like exposing them to these ideas. My thought is, I'm not going to be able to teach them all the strength and conditioning concepts in a workshop.
Right.
What is the best bang for my buck? Knowing that they have so many things to work on, they have all this choreography to do. If I can get them to move in a way and feel and recognize an awareness in their bodies that is different from what they typically feel, in my head, that's good, because
Hmm.
they've made a connection. They've made a connection, and hopefully that's something they can refer back to. And we're in it for the long run, right? With what we do, oftentimes it's like 4 years later they come back, or it's happening now. So since Dance Prehab has been around for a little bit, but now 3-4 years down the road, we get dancers coming back being like, that thing you talked about. They talked about it where I'm here, and I'm like, great. So you knew about that already, or that you set that foundation for them to already begin to understand it.
Hmm.
Yeah, sort of like laying the groundwork a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't need you to, do this exercise perfectly. I just need you to understand that your body is going to feel different moving in these ways. And
Hmm.
if you can take that and understand that it's not about a singular exercise, but it's about your relationship to forces, relationship to gravity, relationship to movement and shapes and transitions, then that's a whole that hopefully becomes a little bit more ingrained and embedded in sort of their brains in a kinesthetic sort of way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I think with a lot of that too, it's like, you're exposing them to some of these specific concepts and different ways to apply some of them, but giving them the opportunity to like, okay, I learned it in this context. Now, how can it apply in this other context? Or,
Yes.
one of my favorite things working with my dancers is whether it's with specific exercise or cueing or who knows what all can go into it, when they can feel like, for example, when they have their arm held in whatever port de bras position, and it's like my arms get tired or achy or whatever. And then we teach them, well, what if we activate from this other place, and just kind of reframe stuff for them a little bit. And then they go back to that same exact position and they're like, that's so much easier, or my turn felt so much better and I didn't have to fight for it and think about it so
Mhm.
hard, or just kind of creating that ease and efficiency of movement for them and teaching them it is possible to feel this way in your dance. And like you said, have the confidence and feel secure in what you're doing with all of it too. That's like my favorite part of working with them, when they have those moments of like, oh, this is different and I like this.
Yes.
Be sure to come back for part 2, coming soon. Dance Med Spotlight is hosted and produced by Alyssa Arms. We discuss all things dance medicine. This has been another episode from Dance Med Spotlight. The Dance Med Spotlight is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can be present.